Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I am Sheikh Katiri. I run the Alexander Hamilton Society at SAIS. And our advisor is the one and only Professor Dr. Dean Emperor Cohen. And so I guilted him to give the society a lecture for us tonight. And he generously agreed despite his very busy schedule. And the subject of the talk is the Art of Strategic Decision, which is a course that he used to teach when he was still teaching. And just a quick intro of the society. It's a national society, and it has chapters in dozens of universities across the country. And its purpose is to bring foreign policy discussions to campuses. It's obviously a little challenging at SAIS since all we have is foreign policy discussion, but we have done a pretty good job so far. The founder of SAIS chapter is actually Professor Cohen himself, who's one of the founders of the National Society and serves on the advisory board. And without further ado, you all know Dean Cohen. And by the way, after the event, if they don't mess up my order for a third event in a row, there will be pizza in the other room.
It's a little bit daunting to know that I'm standing between you and pizza. So thanks. Thanks for this opportunity. You know, there's some good things about being dean, but one of the bad things about being dean is you don't get to teach very much, and I miss that. I particularly miss the course that I'm going to be trying to boil down in a way to one lecture, which is called The Art of Strategic Decision. But hopefully what this lecture contains is the core of what is in that course. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to try to address four questions at varying lengths. First is, what is strategy? What is strategic decision making? A second is, what are the big strategic questions? A third, what are the strategic virtues? And fourth, how are we preparing you to take part in strategic decision making? Now, admittedly, as I look around, I see a number of people, including my old friend Mike Vickers, who actually have done that, so they can comment. But most of you are at the beginning of your careers, and you'll find yourself in a position to make some of those decisions. Let's start with the obvious question. What is strategy? I would say it's choice at the highest level, certainly the highest level where there's some real authority. Strategy could be explicit or implicit. It can be good, it can be bad, it can be coherent or incoherent, but it always exists in some way when someone is using force for political purposes. Now, of course, the word strategy is used more broadly than that, and I think it's an interesting question which I find myself mulling over more and more in my current job. Is strategy just about political military affairs, or is it in some ways a more generalized art? That's an interesting question we can go into if you like. But I would say that the key thing about strategy, for me at any rate, is that it occurs in a competitive environment. So it's not like building a bridge. The river's not trying to drown the people building the bridge. It's not going to try to deliberately thwart the building of the bridge. It may react in unforeseen ways, but it's not competitive. Strategy, to my mind, it has a very large element of dealing with a competitive environment. And of course, there's nothing more competitive than war. So, thinking strategically and strategic decision-making is a high-level practical art. In some ways, it can be separable from theory. One of my old teachers, Ed Banfield, used to say, you don't need a theory of kinship to be a good cousin. And there's something about that that's true with regard to strategy as well. In any case, Strategy is about the relationship at the highest level between ends and means. Let me begin by differentiating it from thinking tactically. What's the difference between thinking strategically and thinking tactically? I don't, by the way, in any way intend to discount good tactical thinking about how to take a hill or sink a ship or lay an ambush, but it's very different from strategic thinking. Tactics are concrete, and of necessity, strategy is a lot more conceptual. Tactics are short run, strategy is more long run. Tactics usually build to the single climactic event. Strategy is always thinking about a series of linked events. Let me give you some two examples, one from politics and one from business, to both competitive environments, to illustrate what I mean. It was probably a good move for Ted Cruz to sneer at New York values in Iowa in 2016. It was probably tactically successful. Strategically, running against Donald Trump, it really wasn't. And he discovered that. Or in the world of business, most of you are probably too young to remember New Coke. Coca-Cola decided to reformulate the flavor in order to appeal to what they thought were younger tastes, and maybe they did indeed for a while appeal to a younger demographic. It was a tactical success. Strategically, it was terrible for a long-lasting brand, and of course they walked that back and went back to the old formula. Remember, those of you in the strategic studies program, Carl von Clausewitz saying that these are fundamentally different kinds of decision-making that require fundamentally different kinds of people. The same kind of people who may be brilliant at tactics are not necessarily great at strategy, and vice versa. So what does strategic decision-making mean? Well, one way to think about it is it means being able to sit around a table with a bunch of people and talk things through. Admittedly, if you're Napoleon, you might not have to sit around the table, or if you do, you might sit at the table and just talk to yourself. But most of us are not Napoleon, and by the end, Napoleon II would have benefited from having a process of discussion and deliberation rather than a band of flunkies. What I would say is, in that context, being able to think well about strategy requires asking and being able to answer 7 big questions, and I want to walk you through those. Now, there's then a whole another level of achievement, which is about being able to then take the answers into action. But I think these 7 questions are primary. So the first question is about knowing the environment, or asking the question, what is going on? Before you decide what you're trying to do, just understanding the environment. Forming some reasonable judgment of the actors, yourself, allies, neutrals, the enemy. Not perfect knowledge, but the fundamentals. Remember what Sun Tzu said? Know the enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles you will not be defeated. Remember his stress on knowing oneself. That, I think, is a frequently missing element of strategy. And there are a lot of examples of people who may have been great strategic thinkers in one sense, who were awful at that. One example from World War I would be the chief of the general staff of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a man of whom most of you have, I'm sure, never heard, named Konrad von Hötzendorf, who was actually in some ways quite a brilliant soldier. And developed some quite brilliant war plans against Serbia. His biggest mistake was misjudging his own country's capacity. And in particular, it's his country's capacity to recover from some initial setbacks in going to war with Russia. A key element, I think, of good strategic decision-making is a sense of proportion about yourself, to include a willingness to adapt to circumstances rather than cling to your previous positions. Knowing what's going on is also about an awareness of the interconnectedness of things. The Germans failed in that in the Second Moroccan Crisis, which is probably the most important diplomatic event that led up to the Second World War. That's in 1911. They get into a confrontation with the French over Morocco, and they successfully bully the French into accommodating their wishes, failing to understand that by so doing, they absolutely terrify the British, who think that the Germans are now driving to get a seaport on the Moroccan coast on the Atlantic, which from Britain's point of view completely transforms the naval balance in the Atlantic. That was the last thing, by the way, that the Germans were actually thinking of. But they failed to think, well, maybe this isn't just about us and the French, it's about how other people will see things. Similarly, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy and his main advisors believed that the crisis was fundamentally about Berlin, not about Cuba. Now, luckily, it didn't cause a disastrous outcome, but they misjudged the way things were connected. And sometimes one sees connections, as they did, that weren't really there. A little bit later on in the lecture, I'll talk about a way in which I feel I made some misjudgments in terms of this first strategic question, which is knowing what's going on. Second question has to do with the enemy. And the question there is, who are those guys? How many of you have seen the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? Oh. All right, so get onto Netflix and get it. So I'm dating myself by mentioning it. It's a wonderful movie with Paul Newman and Robert Redford in their prime, playing two robbers just as the Wild West is being settled and domesticated. And they are about as nice a bunch of train robbers as you could possibly imagine. They're not particularly violent. They just hold up trains and take the money. And one day they hold up a train, as they often do, and they collect the money non-violently. And then one of the boxcars pops open, and half a dozen people begin chasing them, half a dozen armed men. And there's then a chase scene, and they do all the usual stuff. They ride through the creek, and they jump off cliffs, and double back, and all that stuff. And it doesn't shake these guys off. And they keep on doing it, and this has never happened to them before. And at one point, Paul Newman, who's the smarter one of the pair in the movie, turns to Robert Redford and says, "Who are those guys?" Now, as it turns out, these are the best railroad detectives in the world, and they've been put on them by the owners of the railroad because they really are determined to finish Robert Redford and Paul Newman off for good. But what's interesting about that is, if you think about it, what is the question that Paul Newman is actually asking? He's not asking how many of them there are. He can see that. He isn't asking what kind of horses are they riding. They can see that they're riding horses. He's not asking anything about their weapons. They're carrying Colt 45s and Winchester rifles. What he's asking is actually fundamentally a strategic question, which is, who are those guys? Why are they doing what they're doing? Why are they so committed in a way that none of their predecessors were? How do they view us? And so on. And the answer to that question actually really gets to the heart of what the movie is about. Often, intelligence communities are not really in a position to answer that question, or they don't do very well at it, I would say. And it's one of the reasons why political leaders are sometimes better at that sort of analysis than intelligence experts. Churchill was, I would argue, in some ways a better intelligence officer than his intelligence officers, and certainly a better strategist than Hitler, because he could understand Hitler better than Hitler could understand him. And that, by the way, is generally true of liberal democracies. It's a source of strategic strength. And it's why empathy, which I'll talk about later on, is such an important strategic quality. Politicians, as I said, are often better at this than military people, partly because they have more practice themselves being chameleons, and partly because they've got more chameleons working alongside them. I'll return to that point. Third question is ends, or what are we trying to do? Now that might seem like a pretty straightforward question. Actually, it is usually a lot more complex and a lot more subtle than people let on. It's not about a simple mission statement. By the way, there are plenty of seats up front, so no need to sit against the wall. And if you're afraid to sit up front, there are places in the middle. It's not about a simple mission statement in the kind of traditional military sense, but something a lot more subtle. Obviously, as you think about ends, you have to be thinking about doing something that is materially possible, but, and I think this is a critical issue in strategy, something that is politically and psychologically possible. That is to say, and it took me a long time to learn this, some of you may have heard me say there's no such thing as the Platonic ideal of a policy. There's only a policy that can be executed by a particular group of people at a particular time. So the ends have to be not just physically possible, but politically and psychologically possible. Objectives, certainly when you talk about strategy, are very rarely single and clear. They're often multiple. World War II. Yes, the United States wants to beat the Axis powers. It also wants to create a different kind of world order in the aftermath of the war, and that's a little bit different. Objectives, when you're thinking strategically, may affect multiple audiences, not just the enemy, but how you want to change neutrals or friends. There are a lot of branches when you think about ends, and at some point you have to know which ends you're willing to sacrifice. After all, why did Great Britain go to war in 1939? Nominally to preserve Polish independence. What has it sacrificed in 1945 before VE Day? Polish independence. For that reason, by the way, an awful lot of often objectives in strategy are implicit. They are not fully stated. And they're not fully stated for a whole bunch of reasons. But they might be things like, if you're in Iraq, how much civil war are we willing to accept? Or more painfully right now, perhaps in a place like Afghanistan, how much are we willing to walk away from rights for women? Or turn a blind eye to the abuse of children? It's an interesting question. How much of strategy can be divulged publicly? How much of it can be shared in government circles? How much of it has to stay in the head of a country's leader? How much of it is subconscious and has to be so because to admit what you're doing would just be too painful? And that, I think, in terms of the hardest choices, is often the case. The leader himself or herself can't acknowledge to themselves what their own objectives are. I'll give you just one example, and we might even ask Mike if he wants to speak to that a bit. In Afghanistan, you could argue at the end we end up fighting in part for reputational stakes. We can't give up on it because to admit that we failed means first admitting domestically that these dead have died in vain, to misquote Lincoln's second inaugural. But also you cannot tell people we're fighting actually not because of the reason we came, but so that it won't look like we can lose. That's a very, very hard thing to admit, and in my experience at least, political leaders won't admit that. And it causes an enormous amount of psychological stress. And if you want an example of that, I would refer you to the memoirs of then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Means. What are the tools we have available? Understanding the tools you propose to use and selecting those which make sense for the purposes you have in mind. In the military world, and to some extent in other walks of life as well, part of the challenge of strategy is that it involves two different kinds of expertise, both a kind of linear technical expertise and nonlinear political expertise. Scientists don't usually make good strategists for the same reason that they don't make good theologians. They're not going to be good at the elements of strategy which can't be rendered into metrics or numbers or equations. Often, senior decision makers know this truth only imperfectly. They're sometimes aware of their lack of technical expertise, but they're not quite sure how exactly they should get it. By the way, when I say one needs to understand the tools that we have available, that again gets very much to what I spoke about at the beginning. That is to say, understanding what's going on and understanding oneself. American leaders in 2003, including very much yours truly, underestimated just how bad we would be at counterinsurgency and just how long it would take us to adapt to the challenges of Iraq. And I often think about that as my own error of judgment. The fifth and sixth questions have to do with sequence and priority. What comes first and what comes second is the first question. And secondly, what is really important and what isn't? Thinking in terms of sequence and priority, that's where strategy as checklist, which is often the governmental version of strategy, here's the different things we need to do, check, 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 fails. What comes first, and above all, why it comes first, is critical. If it's World War II, do you try to beat Germany first or Japan? If you act in both theaters, which one has priority? It affects decisions in smaller wars. Do you go first after the regime or after its military? Do you put more emphasis on apprehending a terrorist organization's leaders or on cutting off their underlying support? Sometimes, of course, particularly if you're the United States of America, you may try to do it all and do it all simultaneously. But here, the economists chime in and point out that you may have to allocate scarce resources and you may face trade-offs. And even the United States of America faces trade-offs. Note, too, the notion of path dependence. Where you start will then determine your succeeding choices. I think implicit in thinking about sequencing is the ability to anticipate some, although not all, of the problems you will encounter, identifying the uncertainties and some of the branch points. Part of the ability of a great strategic thinker, and I would point to someone like Churchill, is the ability to divide the past, present, and future into analytically measurable chunks, configured not arbitrarily, but to actual circumstances, and then to think through the future several moves at a time. The alternative is to do what is described in a wonderful novel about World War II, Guard of Honor, by James Gould Cousins, who was he was a very famous novelist who became an aide to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army Air Force during the war. And it's a novel that takes place entirely stateside. And he has this wonderful description of a certain kind of decision-making personality. It was the habit of all of them to look straight and not very far ahead. They saw their immediate duties and did those not vaguely or stupidly, but in an experienced, firm way. Then they waited until whatever was going to happen, happened. They sized this up, noted whatever new duties were there, and did those. Their position was that of a chess player who had in his head no moves beyond the one it was now his turn to make. He would be dumbfounded when, after he had made 4 or 5 such moves, each sensible enough in itself, sudden catastrophe from an unexpected direction by an unexpected means fell on him and he was mated. For anybody who's studied decision-making in Vietnam, that's exactly what happened. You know, you can now see all the records that are in any way relevant to the decisions made by the Kennedy and the Johnson administration. Go look at the foreign relations of the United States, either online or in those volumes. And at no point will you see people making stupid decisions. You will see people making the best possible decision they could under the circumstances at the time. What you don't see is people thinking 2, 3 moves ahead and trying to look deeper onto the chessboard. It can be very difficult, think about priorities, to say that something is less important than others. The preferred weasel phrase in the American government is, we will accept risk. But in life, we know you better decide what is more and less important. And there, too, human beings don't like facing that. The seventh question, and in some ways the most important, has to do with a theory of victory. Or, to put it as a question, why do we think this is supposed to work? A logic, no matter how rough and ready, for how we hope we can get what we want. In some ways, you might say it's a little bit like a social scientific theory. This is why we think the other side will yield. In some ways, it's a version of history you can tell, a story. And by the way, don't underestimate the power of being able to tell a story when it comes to strategic decision making. A plausible story of how we get from here to there. What is truly remarkable, and I must say this, my own experience in government reinforced that, is how rarely that question, why do we think this will work, gets asked. The focus tends to be either on tactics, which are much more concrete, on inputs, how many troops are we sending, how much foreign aid are we providing, rather than outputs. And it's outputs which really determine whether or not you're successful. Having a theory of victory, a theory that can handle setbacks, that can adjust to changes in the environment or the fortunes of war, new setbacks and new opportunities, that's a robust theory of victory. Now, being a strategic thinker does not necessarily mean being an effective at execution. And I think, again, one of the great lessons for me of government service is that although clear-headed strategic thinking is essential, it's just the beginning. What matters is execution or implementation. And to be effective at execution requires not so much skills in the narrow sense, although there's some of that, than some qualities of character. And that's what I want to begin talking about. Qualities of character that are not at all intellectual, which may seem like a strange thing for a professor to say. Very famous moment during the revolutions of 1848, the King of Prussia is losing his nerve, is beginning to panic, and Otto von Bismarck, his prime minister, turns to him and says, "Ein König muss zu schlafen können." A king has to be able to sleep. King was saying, I'm so upset about this, I can't sleep. The king has to be able to sleep. What Bismarck was pointing out was a certain kind of strategic virtue, and he was telling the king that he needed it. So to engage in actual strategic decision making, the main thing I want to talk about is the question of character. Being strategically effective is an art, and all great art requires a certain kind of virtue. So let me turn to an authority on strategic virtue, the last good Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who spent most of his time on the frontier fighting Rome's wars. And as he was fighting, he was philosophically inclined. Remember that in the ancient world, philosophy is not the way we think about it now as a pretty abstruse discipline. It's dealing with the question, how do I lead my life? And he wrote down a number of reflections, probably for his own use, without the intent of publishing them. But they have lasted, and they've come down through history as the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And I want us to spend a little bit of time with him. He was very much a Stoic. He begins by saying, the art of living resembles wrestling more than dancing, inasmuch as it stands prepared and unshaken to meet what comes and what it did not foresee. He understood that the future was uncontrollable and in many ways unforeseeable. That doesn't mean, though, that you can't prepare for it. In the use of principles, he says in Book 12, model yourself on the boxer, not the gladiator. The one puts away the sword he uses and takes it up again. The other has his hand always and need but clench it. The wrestler and the boxer, in other words, train hard and are more ready for the inevitable uncertainties of life than the dancer or the gladiator. Okay, so then what are the virtues that Marcus is talking about? And what specifically are the strategic virtues? The first, which I'll call an eye for essentials, is most emphatically not a question of intellect, it's a question of judgment. Two different things. Here are the words of Charles Dana, who was Assistant Secretary of War during the Lincoln administration, a newspaper man with a very successful career, including in government service and in the press, speaking about Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln was not what is called an educated man. What education he had picked up. He had read a great many books, and all the books that he had read, he knew. He had a tenacious memory, just as he had an ability to see the essential thing. He never took an unimportant point and went off upon that, but he always laid hold of the real question and attended to that, giving no more thought to other points than was indispensably necessary. Well, anybody who's ever been in any kind of meeting knows that the number of people who can actually take hold of the real question and ignore the things that are not necessary are very rare. But this is something you can begin to do now. You can train yourself to look for the heart of a problem, and you should. And you should be aware that in any organizational setting, and strategy is, as I said, very much a group effort, the tendency is overwhelmingly to pursue irrelevancies, to get bogged down in minor issues, and it's the great waster of time. It's not a question here of details versus big ideas or big issues, because details may be very important. It's a question of what really counts. And when I say train yourself to look for the heart of a problem, I think that also means training yourself to say, and this, and that are really not particularly important. Winston Churchill had a habit with regard to just about everything of saying, what are the dominant facts? Or what are the big themes? In fact, he once sent back a dessert growling that this pudding lacks a theme, which is maybe a little bit too much. But I think that is actually very valuable training. And I have to confess to you that as a dean, here as elsewhere, I find these words coming back to haunt me, too. A second virtue is honesty. Now, by honesty, I do not mean candor. At times, good strategists withhold the truth or even misrepresent it. Churchill, of course, once said, in wartime, the truth is so precious that it must be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. They may mislead their own subordinates or even manipulate them. Franklin Roosevelt did that. But to succeed, they had to be honest with themselves, honest about what they knew and what they didn't know, honest about what's really happening insofar as it was knowable, succumbing neither to wishful thinking nor fear-mongering. And indeed, I would say wishful thinking is one of the great enemies of strategic thought. Charles Dana again. Another remarkable peculiarity of Mr. Lincoln's was that he seemed to have no illusions. He had no freakish notions that things were so or might be so when they were not so. All his thinking and reasoning, all his mind, in short, was based continually upon actual facts, upon facts of which he saw the essence. I never heard him once say anything that was not so. I never heard him foretell things. I should say, perhaps, that his greatest quality was wisdom, and that is something superior to talent, superior to education. So, Dana's view is that this was genius, and indeed it was in a certain way, but there are ways to develop this faculty. And here I would say, to the extent you can, keep a journal, pass judgments, and periodically force yourself to look at the results. I've done that, and it's very painful because you realize how often you were wrong. Empathy. Empathy is about getting inside the other's skin. It's not the same thing as sympathy, which is fellow feeling. It's the ability to imagine the other. That's why John Lukács, a great historian, was right when he said Churchill's great advantage over Hitler is he could imagine what it was like to be Hitler. Hitler could not imagine what it was like to be Churchill. In strategy, because it's competitive, everyone gets fooled. But democracies are as deceptive as any dictatorial opponent, and perhaps more so. And I would argue with Socrates that the variety of democratic society means that it's probably the best place from which to learn to understand the other. If I gave everybody in this room the assignment, I want you to think like the late unlamented Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the leaders of ISIS, you would do it. Maybe not perfectly, but you would kind of get there. But if I had a classroom filled with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's followers and said, I'd like you to think like a bunch of agnostics and atheists and Christians and Jews and Hindus and goodness knows what else, I don't think they'd be very good at it. There'd be some things they might pick up, but I don't think they could be very good at it. So how do you train yourself for this one? Again, Marcus comes to our rescue. Whatever man you meet, say to yourself at once, what are the principles this man entertains about human goods and ills? For if he has certain principles about pleasure and pain and the sources of these, about honor and dishonor, about death and life, it will not seem surprising or strange to me if he acts in certain ways. Simple advice. But again, for anybody who's been in a decision-making kind of situation, it's not the way we usually judge most of the people we meet, and particularly not in difficult circumstances. We tend to fall back on like or dislike, on trust or suspicion, on sympathy or antipathy. We'll get a lot further if we ask, what does this person respect, value, and enjoy, even if I don't? And what does he or she condemn, despise, and dislike, whether or not I do as well? You get a lot further. By the way, that includes dealing with one's own coworkers. The most successful military people that I ever met dealing with diplomats or vice versa were the ones who spent time figuring out what qualities were valued by people from a world very different from their own. By the way, it's not easy to do this for another reason, because it means creating a kind of artificial distance from the human being you are interacting with. And that is something that doesn't really come naturally to us. It means looking at them from 500 yards away. Final virtue, the most important of them all, is courage. The virtue that makes all others possible, as Churchill said. Or as Marcus said, be like the headland on which the waves continually break, but it stands firm, and about it the boiling waters sink to sleep. That's a lot easier said than done. I consider myself a non-practicing Stoic. And that's essentially what, Marcus felt one should be a practicing Stoic, although if you read the stuff he's going through, you can tell he found it pretty hard to be a Stoic as well. If there's one thing that one can learn from the sorts of things you'll learn here, it's that most decisions, including most big strategic decisions, are something in the nature of gambles. That's a very hard thing for human beings to accept. If you read a lot of memoirs and biographies, you'll have a sense of what extraordinary pressures operate on political and military leaders. And you may, of course, many of you will come to feel some of those yourself. You will learn at a certain point that you can do everything right and still end up with failure. To be able to act in such circumstances requires courage. Where one finds it, that really depends on individuals. But I do tend to believe that you're right. You find it within what Marcus calls the citadel within, the very core of who you are. And this takes me to my final point. You may be listening to this and saying, well, this is all very well, but my first job out of SAIS is not likely to be Secretary of Defense or anything remotely like it. True enough. But think again about Marcus Aurelius. For him, Stoicism was a system of spiritual training for the great tests of life, which he eventually faced. And he didn't think that you begin that kind of training when you're 50. For him, it began by learning how to sleep without a blanket, which I don't particularly recommend. You can begin training yourself now, right now, to play a role, if not as the most senior person, but as an assistant or as a subordinate. You can begin getting in the habit of asking the 7 questions. You can begin getting in the habit of cultivating those virtues. You can spend time with and learn from some of the extraordinary people who have been in the room, as they say in Hamilton, who are either at this school or visiting it. One of the hardest things to do as a subordinate, and it still happens to me, is the difficulty of getting into your boss's head, figuring out what they need when they cannot really articulate it themselves. SAIS can help you do that. And of course, we can teach you some of the practical skills, reading, writing, speaking, organizing, that will make you useful and effective. But most of all, you can go out into the world in the spirit of Marcus Aurelius, knowing that particularly when you enter the realm of strategy, you will encounter all kinds of desperate situations. As Churchill famously said in his memoir, My Early Life, about the Boer War, this is after he tried to rush out there because he was afraid the whole thing would be over in 8 weeks. And of course, instead it lasted 3 bloody years. He said, let us learn our lessons. Never, never, never believe any war will be smooth and easy, or that anyone who embarks on that strange voyage can measure the tides and hurricanes he will encounter. The statesman who yields to war fever must realize that once the signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but the slave of unforeseeable and uncontrollable events. Antiquated war offices, weak, incompetent, or arrogant commanders, untrustworthy allies, hostile neutrals, malignant fortune, ugly surprises, awful miscalculations, all take their seats at the council board on the morrow of a declaration of war. Always remember, however sure you are that you can easily win, that there would not be a war if the other man did not think he also had a chance. Here's a different way of framing that. To be good in the long run at strategic decision making, there's one more virtue to think about, and that's humility. I will confess that it took me a long, long time to get to the idea of humility as a strategic virtue. As a concept, it's alien to most professors, and in some ways it's alien to academic life altogether. We are rewarded, and by the way, we reward our students, that would be you, for being decisive, forthright, and self-confident. But I think in the memoirs of some of the great leaders, be it a Jim Mattis or my favorite from World War II, William Slim, or in the biographies of someone like Lincoln, you will see just how indispensable humility is. The ability to see yourself as a servant of a larger good rather than as master of a smaller group, the willingness to acknowledge error and then press on nonetheless, the ability to recognize talent in others and celebrate and promote and reinforce them, these are all indispensable. So here's my final message. You came here to learn the big ideas and perhaps now realize as well that you need the practical skills. Good, we can give you both of those. But what you will need most of all, I believe, or rather I'd put it this way, those will not be worth very much without qualities of character that we as faculty can only describe and that you have to cultivate for yourself. And the good news, of course, is that I have no doubt that you're all up to the challenge. So with that, let me stop and take any questions or thoughts or comments that you might have. Sure.
Hello. So one of the things that I found most compelling inside of this talk was the idea of a leader's ability to deceive themselves into thinking about what their objectives in war are.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if there is something about the wars that we're currently engaged in, particularly irregular wars, that lead towards the proliferation of this capacity for self-deceit. And part of me is afraid that if that's true, that the shift towards the Indo-Pacific and great power rivalry with Russia and China might be a desire to regain the simplicity of actually knowing what those aims should be.
So I think one of the things that that opens the way for a certain amount of self-deception has to do with the sensitivity of all of our leaders to casualties. And in order to be able to justify to yourself, unless you're a completely callous human being, the kinds of things that a president will see if they go to Dover Air Force Base when the caskets are rolled off the plane, or visiting Walter Reed and seeing people who've been horribly mutilated, it makes it very hard to accept some cold-blooded rationales for doing what you were doing. You know, in the past, presidents really didn't do very much of that. And even general officers didn't feel, I think, the psychological strain of losing people in anything like the same way. You know, my favorite example of that is if, you know, when you went to Afghanistan I and others went to Afghanistan and Iraq, you would see general officers wandering around the battlefield with a breast pocket filled with photographs of soldiers who had fallen under their command. And it takes tremendous strength of character to have those right next to your heart the whole time, and then to make pretty hard and cold-blooded decisions. And so I think then you begin to construct explanations for yourself, either to justify it or just to say, I'm not going to have anything to do with this, when neither may really apply. I think that's part of the nature of the current wars that we've got. And the other thing is that, particularly in that context, being able to think straight about credibility, which is something that you can't really measure, but really is pretty important, which is something politicians instinctively know, but they have trouble articulating. There have been other things of that kind where people just found it hard to wrestle with them. The one last example that I would give, this was one that was apparent very early on in Iraq in 2003. When you talk to American leaders, political leaders, about our objectives and about particularly anything that had to do with democracy, and you try to say, well, okay, what sort of objective do we have for Iraq? Sweden, no. You know, Romania right after the fall of the Ceausescus, well, that doesn't sound all that great. And so they never really wrestled with that. If I could, I'd like to put my old friend Mike Vickers on the spot, because he saw a lot of this up close as a pretty senior official in the Defense Department for quite a long time. Can I do that to you, Mike? And of course, SAIS PhD.
Sure. So, I think irregular wars are even more touched by politics, and it's harder to do the theory of victory. It's certainly not a checklist. And so, so as Professor Cohen was saying, in Afghanistan, we follow a natural path of, trying to push the Taliban down and to build up the Afghan forces to the point where we can eventually leave and achieve some outcome. That's easier said than done. And so each move looks pretty good to you, and each year maybe doesn't look so bad, but what actually makes them quit at some point is tougher than, I think, in conventional war, or at least the kinds that we fought recently. And I would even argue, I've spent a lot of time on counterterrorism too, and drone campaigns and the bin Laden raid and other stuff like that. That, in a way, is somewhat of a more manageable problem. It's fundamentally an intelligence problem. It's a very hard one, but it's not the same as just a protracted insurgency and when they have a sanctuary, or like in the case of Iraq, where we achieve an operational victory only to lose it to very bad politics and circumstances after we leave. Now, you could say President Obama made a bad decision to treat Iraq as a normal country after 2011, and combined with the Syrian civil war, you get the rise of ISIS, and it undoes everything. Possibly, but events in Syria played a big role. It wasn't just events in Iraq; they were interrelated. So, it's a challenging proposition. I would argue also, though, that the competitions with Russia and China aren't necessarily a walk in the park, in a sense that, anytime you look at something, a protracted competition like the Cold War, you're not sure how it's going to turn out. And the more you have things like the rise of information wars, where you're hollowing out society, where you're attacking the population's will over a protracted period of time, that's harder to get your hands around than direct conflict. Same with, say, economic and technological competition with China may far more determine the outcome than any given series of events or any conflict.
I'll just add two more things to that. One is, in these wars in particular, but I think in all conflict, don't underestimate how hard it is to answer some of these questions. So let's start with, who are those guys? I remember when I was at State working on our Afghan strategy, I kept on asking the intelligence community, they would tell you how they thought the war was going. What I kept on asking them was, tell me how the Quetta Shura thinks the war is going. They just really, they couldn't really do that. And it's not because they're stupid or didn't have resources, far from it. It's just a lot of these questions are extraordinarily hard to deal with and extraordinarily hard to wrestle with. So we'll give you another example more recently, dealing with Iran. So you could ask members of the administration, what's our theory of victory? I mean, the supposed theory of victory is ridiculous. We really put a squeeze on them, we schwack Qasem Soleimani, and then say, okay, we'll sign a much better nuclear deal, which we're in. We promise to stop making mischief around the Middle East. I mean, if there's one thing that's probably not going to happen, that's it, okay? That won't happen. But if not, what's the theory of victory? That you bring them really to collapse? Really? Tell me that story. Tell me that story. And there's not really a plausible story, I think, to be told there. And then one last thing I'll just say is the biggest caveat of all. So I now find myself dean of the school and having to make some very difficult decisions about our future, and deal with all kinds of actors. And it's not war. Nobody's tried to kill me yet. That may change. But you know what? All the things that I find myself critiquing in others, I see happening to me. And I think it's just what happens when you're in a position of high responsibility with a lot of pressure. And you just hope to be a little bit better than you were the day before at it. Yeah. And then Christina.
So if I can turn the conversation to the situation at home for a moment.
Is that on?
Yes.
It is?
Can you hear me? Okay. Taking the conversation, turning it inward, domestically, looking at threats like disinformation, various forms of extremism, and even more esoteric ones where there may not be an easily identifiable enemy like climate change or rising income inequality. How do you prepare our civilian population for these sorts of challenges and instilling them with strategic virtue?
Well, there again, and maybe I'm just becoming an aging moralist. I think a lot of it does come down to character. There are technical kinds of questions. How do I know that the stuff that's coming across the transom in Facebook is probably manufactured by some Russian bot or something? There's a certain kind of sophistication that you need there. But I think the larger issues do become ones of character and thinking about what does it mean to be a citizen and how you deal with citizens who disagree with you, and how do you forge compromise and so on. I have an article that's coming out in a book which is about historical education. And one of the things I talk about is the delicate subject of patriotic history. I mean, obviously you don't want simply a rosy colored picture of your past, but you need a past that's going to inspire people to be resilient, to be forbearing in some ways, to make a system work. Those are not things that really have to do with social media. Actually, not at all. They have much more to do with how you educate your kids and what you get them used to, or simply getting people into a position where they can talk to one another again and try to. I'll give you an example. So, I mean, a place like SAIS, you know, I'm sure there are Trump supporters here, and I hope that they feel comfortable speaking out. But this is predominantly, I'm sure, because this is sort of deep state U. It's probably a population that's largely hostile to Trump. And so the easiest way to explain the successes of the administration, beginning with the election itself, is to say, you know, Russian bots, corruption, you know, bullying, you know, spinelessness, right? Maybe to some extent. But actually, you'd be a lot better off if you figure out why do so many people who actually are certifiably decent, honorable people go in that direction, which may seem so repugnant to you. And that is a hard hill to get over for a lot of people. You see it in a different way if you look in the UK at Brexit. I mean, I landed in London right after Brexit and right after the vote, and I spent a good day pulling banker friends off windowsills. And then it was just fascinating talking to people, why did this happen? And again, the answers they were all giving were essentially conspiracy theories of one kind or another, the duplicity and mendacity of Nigel Farage and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, then I began saying, well, okay, do you know anybody who lives in Newcastle? So, have you ever visited Newcastle? Do you have any idea why those people in the northern part of England voted the way they did? And they really, not only they didn't, they couldn't even begin to. It's the quality of the empathy was really missing. I mean, they were living in a kind of London that's the biggest island on the Davos archipelago. And they couldn't imagine what life was like in Great Britain. They could imagine what life was like on the Davos archipelago. And that, you know, I think that really got in the way of them. And I think even this is also true when we talk about climate change and lots of other things. Dr. Spohr. No, actually, I'm going to go with Christina first, if I may.
I want to come to a question about the present, but via a detour around the past, because what really struck me in your talk was how you emphasized these virtues and characteristics which are tied up with the individual, the leader. And because I just on the weekend read in the whole book biography of Packer, and I learned a lot about Vietnam from that perspective, it made me think about this aspect. You said, you know, you take one decision and you take another decision. Each decision looks quite right, but then you still get pulled ever deeper into the morass of war, and how the decisions are often also gambles, and you know, a politician takes the courage and takes the gamble. In the First World War context, there's also the theory one takes a calculated risk, but it's nonetheless a risk, and then you carry the responsibility. Now, that aspect of agency, of course, links up with interpretations where one says, well, one slithers into war. We have had that for the First World War. But now, where I bring it to the present, one could say, well, we are out of the Cold War, we are moving perhaps out of what we perceived as this post-Cold War, post-war era, if you so want, into something more unstable, where it's also about these balance of power things, if you think about world order. And again, we have people who have to, and leaders who deal with what's going on, and to also instigate some of the heating up, if you so want. And that brings me to this aspect of humility, because One leader I looked at in the 70s was Helmut Schmidt, and he used a particular German word in relation to World War I, in relation to the 80s, but I think which has relevance for now, which is this word Kriegsvermeidungsstrategie, to have a strategy to avoid war. Now, even to have that while you're technically still in peace, you need to make substantiated, informed decisions. You cannot just act on impulse and you see where I'm going. You can't just dislike things. You have to have the humility to step back and say, if I make this step and if I make that step, then 5 steps beyond, actually, if everybody else reacts in a particular way, this can go wrong, and I don't know where they are standing. And by that, I'm not just criticizing Trump or Johnson or on the other end of the spectrum, perhaps what the Chinese and Russians are doing, but in a totally negative way also the nothing-doingness of the German government. How do you feel these? How can we come back to these characteristics and this very beautiful way you laid out what one should do, what one would expect in a statesman or woman and a leader, when actually you have people who don't even seem to want to know? What shall we do?
Well, we send them to SICE. No, I mean, I think, well, the first thing I'll say is that with all respect to Helmut Schmidt, and you're an authority there, and I'm not, inaction is a strategic decision too. And I think that is part of what makes it really difficult for a country like the United States, where, you know, a Secretary of State or a Secretary of Defense knows or the President for sure, knows if they don't do something, something will probably happen. And furthermore, you never really know what that alternative course would have taken you to. I'm not sure there's a magical solution because, you know, if you look at the leaders of Europe in 1914, they weren't idiots. Herbert Asquith was fluent in ancient Greek. You know, you had brilliant mathematicians. You had people who were extremely well-read and learned. I mean, this does tend to bring you to a somewhat more tragic view of life. I mean, I won't deny that. The only thing I would reaffirm is that this gets to the importance of character. And it's one of the reasons why I personally react badly when somebody says, well, so-and-so has awful character, but he'll do the right things. And, you know, even when the program might be a program you agree with, I mean, since there's no secret about my views of the current administration, there are things that they've done which I have no objection to whatsoever. I'm actually kind of in favor of. But at the end of the day, what terrifies me is character. And I'll go with better character than, as opposed to policies in a narrow sense that I agree with, because at the end of the day, character will trump it in exactly those, so to speak, in those kinds of situations that you're describing. We just privileged students here who are probably all getting ready to run off to 6 o'clock classes. Yeah?
Good evening, my name is Amar. Thank you for your lecture. What did you learn about strategy and decision making as a counselor at the State Department, what you did not know previously as an academic?
So first, the State Department doesn't really do strategy. They do action plans. And strategic planning is not, I mean, there's some strategically minded people there for sure, but the State Department prides itself quite appropriately on its flexibility and adroitness, and the people who do planning are the military. I mean, they're doing that all the time, and they think a little bit more broadly. But I learned a number of things about government service for sure, which at a high level, which I'll share with you. The first is I used to think, I was well aware that personalities were important. I came away thinking they're overwhelmingly important. And you know, when you look, for example, in the first and the second Bush administrations, the relationship between the Defense Department and the State Department in the first term of Bush and the second term of Bush, it had actually relatively little to do with the outside world. It had to do with Colin Powell being replaced by Condi Rice, Donald Rumsfeld being replaced by Bob Gates, and a whole bunch of things cascading down from that, to include Mike Vickers, but also Ambassador Edelman, and other people. And once those personal relationships were different, then the world looks different. Second thing, and again, it wasn't that I didn't know this before, but it was so powerfully reinforced that great ideas are very important. I mean, you're not much of a professor if you don't think ideas are important. But at the end of the day, implementation, so I bake bread as a way of relieving stress and having good things to eat. You know, to my mind, ideas are like the yeast, but you try to make a bread primarily out of yeast, you'll get nowhere. You need vastly more flour and water and salt and all that. That's implementation. And so the ideas don't matter if implementation can't somehow align with them. The third big thing I would say is I used to think that Graham Allison was right. Where you stand depends on where you sit, bureaucratic politics, and there are elements of truth to all that. But my conclusion was that the outcomes in government are more frequently shaped by what I think of as leagues of the like-minded. When you have people who have, yes, they have their parochial departmental interests, but at the end of the day, if they have sort of a common view of the world and a sort of a common view of how to meet the challenges that the world throws at you, that's much more important. And that actually drives a lot of policy. Mike, let me throw that at you again. Yeah. Yeah. I'll take one more. Gentleman in the back there, yeah.
Well, my question is about the strategic virtues that you mentioned. I think for me it was remarkable that when you introduced them, you cited the philosophy of the Stoics.
Yep.
And in a way, I'm not surprised because the virtues are very hard to cultivate. One needs to be hard. But at the same time, there's a feature of civilization that is, you might say, hedonist, or, of course, the benefit of civilization is it brings about security, and after that, comfort. And you may say special kinds of pleasure and enjoyment that otherwise would not be accessible to mankind. So it seems to me that no matter how one trains oneself to be hard and to also be virtuous, there's also an element of needing to soften oneself. How do you find the balance? How would you talk about the balance and even maybe the moderation in your own experience?
I think, you know, Stoicism is Stoicism is actually a moderate philosophy. The key part of Stoicism is understanding what about the world you cannot change. I mean, it's actually very much akin to those of you who are familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy. So you're going to change how you think about things. Because remember, the founder of Stoicism is Epictetus, a crippled Greek slave. So, you know, he knew about his physical disabilities. He knew he was a slave. The difference was, he said, I can change how I think about that. But I would go a little bit further. Stoicism is the right system if you're engaged in conflict, which is, in the understanding that I gave you, what strategy is about. It's no coincidence that Marcus Aurelius was a soldier emperor on the front lines. It is in some ways a soldier's philosophy. And you know, if you just talk to soldiers you know, you'll discover that's kind of their view of the world. It's, the good ones at any rate, it's a Marcus Aurelius kind of world. And I would argue that it's necessary if you think that you're living in a conflictual environment in some way. You can be an Epicurean or all kinds of other things if you don't have to worry that you might have to, you know, defend your villa or your village or your country or anything else. But if you are in the middle of conflict, I think that is the place that you have to go. And it's not, I mean, it's very far from being barbaric or uncivilized or harsh. It's, I would say it's really more about accepting things as they are and accepting the world as it is. And that's actually pretty powerful. So, thank you very much.